They put a ribbon on my chest when I was 20. They called me brave in a town hall full of clapping strangers. They printed my picture in the paper. I sat there in uniform, shoulders straight, and smiled the smile a man learns to wear when he thinks the worst is behind him. I am 91 now. The ribbon still sits in a box in my attic. The smile has been harder to find. They called me a hero. I feel like a fraud. If you want the whole story of that morning, the one in December that changed everything for me, stay with me. I promise I'll tell you why a pile of cans and a scrap of paper made a decorated soldier doubt the meaning of his medals. The morning was December 17th, 1944. Cold, so sharp it felt like a thing with weight. The earth around Hansfeld was hard as iron. Frost cracked under our boots. It wasn't the sort of cold that hushes you. It rang through metal and breath and teeth. There was a dead tiger tank off to my right. Its turret hung low like a tired animal. The hatch was frozen shut, crusted with a sheen of white that no one had bothered to knock away yet. We moved slow because everything was delicate. Men on edge, engines that had been coaxed to life the day before and might not answer today. Smoke hung on the wind from the ruins of a farm, heavy and oily. I remember the smell of gasoline more than anything, sweet and bright and bitter all at once. It's a smell I will never forget. We found the first cans by the orchard. At first I thought they were the Germans' own. A few could be missed in the muddle of retreat. But the caps were different. They were American. Flat, stamped, organized the way their supply columns always managed to be. Then we found more. A scattering became a line became a field, and a field became a mountain. Stacks of jerry cans, neat as cordwood, the kind of neatness that outraged us and confused us and lit something that felt like hope in our chests. I've said hope, but that's not the right word for what men did in that moment. We had been fighting for weeks on iced roads and blackened fields. We were exhausted in a way that thinned the edges of how men keep faith with one another. When the first can broke open on my shovel and the sweet smell of that petrol filled the air, the mood shifted. The nearest corporal laughed out loud, a ridiculous barking noise that made everyone snicker. Men touched tanks like men touching the only thing that could make them whole again. Drivers banged on cranks, praying, cursing, coaxing. Someone produced a cigarette, and the way he lit it looked like a small sacrament. We pulled cans, tipped them into tanks and jerry cans we carried by armfuls back to vehicles. You didn't pause to feel clean about it. There was no moral calculus in that cold. There was only the immediate arithmetic of life and power. Fuel meant motion. Motion meant chance.
The colonel, a practical man with frostbitten ears, barked orders, not because he was cold, but because order made sense where everything else had unraveled. I remember the sound best. Metal clanging against metal as men heaved, the hollow thud of empty can against full can, voices over the wind, slurred and fierce, the tank engine trying, coughing, then catching like someone waking after a long sleep. That engine note, that low, hungry thunk that meant a beast would move under your feet, was the sound that stitched us back together for a few hours. Somewhere in that swarm I found a scrap of paper. It was folded, crumpled, but not torn, like someone had handled it with a care you give to a map. It could have been a newspaper torn off a stack or an American logbook. It had numbers on it in small, efficient type, gallons, dates, city names. And at the time, I did not understand the meaning of those numbers. I only noticed the way the paper felt in my hand, how it rubbed oil into my gloves. Someone laughed behind me about the oddity of reading a newspaper in the middle of a battlefield, and for one instant we were boys again, reading a Sunday sports page. Then a sergeant pointed at a column, and his face changed in a way that made my heart drop. We were filling tanks like men filling their lungs after being underwater. It felt like a victory of sorts, not the kind you write home about, not the grand charges and postcards, but the small kind of victory that keeps you alive another day. We joked, we cursed, we swapped stories about where we'd last seen a full tin of coffee. A lieutenant with soot on his teeth,
in a laugh that had been dead for months, asked for a sip from a can, and drank like a starving man taking his first bite. Then the paper worked its way through the knot of us. Someone read aloud, halting, the numbers tumbling out. Miles of roads cleared, tons of fuel delivered, columns running day and night. It landed on us, the meaning of it did, not as a theory, but as something visceral. The laughter evaporated. The laughter turned to a low sound, like the way a wind moves through a ruined field. I remember that moment with mathematical clarity and childish embarrassment, how quickly joy can curdle when you see the gears behind the machine. We were not merely taking a bag of flour from a pantry. This was a supply system, not random treasure. That scrap of paper was a thread that, when pulled, unraveled a pattern none of us liked. In the months that followed, I read more carefully, not because I wanted to, but because the mind seeks the shape of what it cannot digest. Records show, the kind of records historians later pointed to when they tried to explain the collapse of the Western Front, that American petroleum production in 1944 was on the order of 1.8 billion barrels. German fuel production, synthetic and scraped from the earth, reached only about 33 million barrels that year. Let that sink in. The figures were not close.
They were not a difference of margin. They were a gulf. I did not have those numbers that morning. What I had was a pile of steel cans and a raw, immediate sense that something larger was going on. We hoisted what we could, and we drove away. Men hoisted what they could, because fuel in the machine is the same as food in the body. The next towns over saw the same sight. Abandoned half-tracks with doors open like mouths, tanks with empty treads, vehicles left where they had died. They were not burned, not all of them. They sat in rows like wounded animals waiting for a vet that never came. I have tried all my life to separate individual acts from the system that frames them. You learn to do that in war. Officers teach you that you fight the enemy's decisions, not his people. You learn to honor the bravery of a man who holds a position against impossible odds and to despise the calculus that sent him there. But that day, Hansfeld, that mountain of cans, there came an awareness that bravery and calculation were not just separate things at war, they were of the same fabric. Courage could be a response to scarcity as much as to injustice, and scarcity, I would learn, had a father, the industry and logistics that supply armies, the pipelines and the convoys, and the thousands of hands that make motion possible. Even then, as we filled and left, there were signs that this was not an ordinary cache to be plundered. A day or two later, we heard tales that some of the captured depots had not been left peacefully. Some had been burned, sometimes deliberately by retreating units, sometimes by the victors themselves as a measure of denial and control. I heard of an inferno east of here, a place called Stavalo in the papers I later read, where a captured stock exploded in a blaze that took hours to die. Men told stories of rivers of flame that lit the sky like judgment. The images came back to us in the cold nights, a row of tanks silhouetted against a column of smoke, the smell of burning rubber and oil mingling with the usual reek of winter. Stories folded into other stories. We heard whispers of atrocities, of the Malmedy massacre farther back in time, but not in memory, of prisoners shot in cold blood. You cannot fight a war and pretend such facts do not change the optics of the bravery you or your comrades exhibit. When news of Malmedy reached us, the men I knew were not indifferent. Men who had fought alongside those accused in that slaughter were angry, ashamed, defensive, and afraid. We were a ragged community of people doing the work of soldiers, moving, hiding, surviving. To see that someone somewhere had crossed a line and killed prisoners in cold blood, to know it as a fact, not rumor, was to understand that the moral slope at war is slippery, and the slide often starts with fear and scarcity. I want to be clear. I condemn such actions. I do not excuse them. There is no accounting for every sin of that time that reconciles the loss and the pain. But the human mind seeks reasons, and reasons can be structural as well as personal. The sense of being trapped by supply lines and production, of being outproduced, outfueled, outlived by an enemy whose factories turned out ships of fuel with a steady hum, that was a part of the reality that made men brutal. Not an excuse, never an excuse, but context. We left Hansfeld with what we could carry. A few of our vehicles moved that day, where before they had been sleeping. A few men slept that night with a belly full of a different certainty, that this found fuel might get them home, might get them to the next village, might give them another dawn. When the medals came later, when the photographers came through and someone wrote an account that needed a face, they chose me. I do not know why they chose me. I had a camera-ready face back then, I suppose. I had a decent posture. They liked clean images of men in muddy uniforms. I posed, and the photograph was taken, and a ribbon was pinned on, and the town clapped. Honors have a curious way of flattening truth. The ribbon compresses years of fear and small acts into a single tidy emblem. People love tidy things. They fit on lapels and print well. But the ribbon did not come with a pamphlet explaining supply chains, or how 100 factories humming in Ohio could make the difference between motion and immobilization in the Ardennes. That night in Hansfeld, I sat by a smoldering wreck, one hand on the barrel of my rifle, the other on the scrap of paper I had kept. I must not make too much of that act. Many of us kept odd things from the field. But I held that paper like a talisman, because it was the first tangible thing that suggested a truth no one wanted to name. Our misery in many places was not purely the result of poor leadership or bad luck. It was a matter of scale. In the months after, I would learn names for things I had only intuited. Pluto, a pipeline under the sea. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system that ran supplies day and night. The sheer multiplication of trucks and men moving fuel forward in lines so long they read like rivers on the map. I would learn that armies are fed by factories, not gallantry, and that no amount of courage can substitute for a factory running at full tilt. For that first winter day, though, we were simply men delighted at a find. We took what we could. We also carried a dawning unease. There was an ache in the pit of my stomach I could not name. Not guilt exactly, not at first, but a strange knowledge that what we had found was part of a machine so vast that to touch a small piece of it felt like reaching through a wall. We had seen shortages before. A rationed cigarette here, a canteen handed down empty there. But abundance in the enemy's hands felt obscene. It made our hunger look not like a bad turn of fortune, but like the sign of a larger failure.
If the enemy could pump and ship fuel in quantities that turned into columns and pipelines and night convoys, what did that say about our leaders, our industry, our state? If men behind a factory gate could be turned into a river of petrol crossing an ocean, then the heroics of a single field could be swallowed by the greater calculus of production. The men around me argued in low voices about what to do with the cans. Some wanted to stack them and leave them for the next patrol. Some wanted to take every can and make a run for it. There was no time for proper decision-making. You do what you can, and later you heap the reasons into order. I remember the lieutenant who told a joke about being too old to lug fuel. He had a gravel in his laugh and frost in his beard, and the driver who wept because his brother had died for lack of a stretcher on a day that a convoy could have carried one if it had had the fuel. That image has haunted me. The stretcher unused because the truck which should have been there had no gas. The more I tried to reconcile what we were doing with what I was taught, the more the edges blurred. The applause years later for bravery felt in the marrow like a misunderstanding. That is the honest word for how it felt. Misunderstanding. People clapped for the visible things, the charge, the courage, the action. They did not see the scaffolding beneath it, the factories turning, the pipelines laid, the millions of gallons moved. They did not see how whole battle plans rose or fell on the invisible work of logistics. There were others around Hansfeld who saw the same thing and spoke it plainly. A regimental commander whose name in later reports appears as Piper. Some documents identify him that way. Others mark his name as indefinito, where records were garbled, looked at the piles and did not smile. He stared for a long time, hands in his pockets, and then spoke with a flatness that cut through the small talk. "They have more of this than we can guess," he said, and the way he said it suggested he had been thinking in a language of supply lines for a while. Soldiers heard statements like that and felt something like defeat settle in their bones. It is not that men stopped fighting. They simply realized that the field is one thing and the machine behind it another. People will want a neat moral here. Either the men were heroes for the small things they did and deserving of honor, or they were complicit in the machinery of death. Real life refuses such neatness. One detail does not cancel the other. You can be brave and still be part of a system that does harmful things. You can save a comrade's life and later learn a truth that makes that saving hollow in the larger picture. Perhaps that is why the ribbon sits in a box, not because I don't value it, but because it only ever tells half the story.
By the time we reached the lane outside Hansfeld, the sun had climbed a little, and the cold had given us a thin sheen of dew that made everything look like a painting. We passed a column of what had been German vehicles. They had been abandoned not because they were shot up, but simply because they had no fuel left. Their engines were intact, their treads unbroken. They sat like monuments to the fact that without the right substance, machines, no matter how mighty on paper, are no more useful than ruins. A man at the back of our column tried, half-hearted, to move a small tank. He hit the starter and the engine squealed, coughed, and died. Around him, the men's faces shifted from hope to the sort of weary humor you get when you realize a joke has been told at your expense. We had been handed the means of motion on a silver platter at Hansfeld, and yet we could not claim the power to move whole formations. The cans were a drop in an ocean. We had been given crumbs where bread was needed. That night, I dreamt of lines of tanks with full gauges, engines hot and humming, their fuel indicators marching up like a scoreboard. I dreamt of factories where lamps burned late into the night, and men with grease on their hands packed barrels into crates and loaded them onto ships. In the dream, the machines of the world worked in a rhythm so steady that it felt like a law of nature. I woke with the taste of oil in my mouth and an ache that felt like a moral question. I told myself the ache was only my conscience trying to do its job. Conscience is a fine and thorny instrument. It makes you account for things you cannot change. But the feeling was not merely private. It spread through corners of our unit in ways that changed behavior. Men who had been men of small courage suddenly became bitter. They lashed out at officers for orders that seemed to have no sense. Others sank into a quiet, a particular kind of silence you notice in men who have seen a functioning thing fail for lack of something basic. In the weeks that followed, reports trickled in from other fronts that confirmed what our scrap of paper hinted at. The Allies were moving fuel with an efficiency we could not match. They had convoys, they had pipelines, and they had a production capacity that dwarfed ours. Pluto, the undersea pipeline the Allies were laying to feed the front, was not yet a household name in our foxholes, but the idea of an endless supply running under the waves felt like a legend that might be true. The Red Ball Express, a chain of trucks and drivers hauling day and night, became the stuff of rumor and reluctant admiration. Numbers I read much later put it into clearer light. The United States, by 1944, produced roughly 1.8 billion barrels of petroleum. Germany produced approximately 33 million barrels. Those figures are not mere statistics to me. They are the explanation for 1,000 small tragedies and 1,000,000 decisions that followed scarcity.
I did not have those numbers in Hansfeld. I had men laughing and men weeping, and a pile of cans and a scrap of paper. I had the taste of petrol and the sound of an engine that might have lived if only it had had more. Already then, the contrast between abundance and scarcity felt like a moral mirror held up to us. We saw ourselves reflected back as both noble and insufficient. We saw courage and futility in the same frame. When I walk into a museum now and see a tank with a plaque that tells you the name of the battle and the heroics that took place, I pay attention to the small printed lines. Museums like tidy narratives. They prefer the act of valor to the messy behind-the-scenes details that reveal how the act was possible or impossible. The plaque will tell you what the soldier did that day. It will rarely tell you that the soldier stood there because somewhere else, a factory in America, had pumped out the fuel that made motion possible. It will not tell you how savage scarcity had made men into something other than the idealized image we prefer. That disjunction between the public story and the private truth, between the ribbon on my chest and the scrap of paper in my pocket, is what haunts me. It is also what compelled me, through long years of living, to try to learn the contours of the larger story. I could not live my life on a single morning. The morning at Hansfeld was a hinge. It opened into the cold dark of a larger understanding, and I have spent the rest of my days trying to make sense of what that opening revealed. But a hinge only works if the door moves. For now, on that December day, the door had only begun to swing. We took what we could. We drove off with our vehicles humming, some moving and some half alive.
We placed our metals in places where sunlight might not reach them, and pretended the world was simpler than it felt. I did not yet have the language for what I was feeling. There was only the immediate, heavy truth. I had been part of something that felt important and wrong at once. I do not tell this story to absolve myself or to ask for pity. I tell it because the ribbon and the scrap of paper are both true and both matter. There is a temptation, still powerful in the telling of wars, to turn men into monuments and to stop there. I learned early that a ribbon cannot hold the weight of a man's conscience. What it can do, if we let it, is start a conversation about what we honor and why. That conversation begins with admitting what we saw and what it meant. It begins with the smell of petrol on frost and the sound of men laughing and men crying beside the same pile of cans. It begins by acknowledging that the machinery of war, pipelines, convoys, factories, shapes the fate of soldiers as much as their courage does. The story does not end at Hansfeld. It unfolds into lines on maps and numbers in ledgers, and into choices made in rooms far from the frozen ground.
The scrap of paper that afternoon was a key without a lock. It hinted at something vast. I kept it folded in my pocket because I needed the ache to remain sharp enough to wake me up. When the next convoy came by and the sergeant shouted orders and the engines rolled, I watched the men's faces and asked a question I had no answer for yet. If bravery is the currency of the soldier, what does it buy when the factory gates are closed? That question stayed with me. It is why I talk about this now, sitting in a quiet house with the ribbon in a box and more years behind me than ahead. It is also why I am honest when people call me brave and I feel like a fraud. The badge on my chest tells a story I can point to, but the scrap of paper in my pocket tells a longer one. A story about fuel, factories, and the scale of production that decides so much of war. In the days after Hansfeld, as columns shuffled and orders changed, we began to put the pieces together. We learned more about what those numbers meant in practice, why a whole squadron could be stopped in its tracks, why lines of tanks lay quiet like a field of monuments, why the enemy sometimes seemed to have an inexhaustible appetite for motion. I will tell you what we learned next, about convoys that never slept and about pipelines under the sea, because those pieces are the other side of the coin that gleamed on my chest. But before we go there, I need to tell you one more thing about that morning, the way it changed what it meant to be a soldier, and the first time I felt the word fraud brush past me like a cold wind. We were not yet ready to call ourselves traitors or saints. We were, at most, bewildered. We had trophies in our hands and doubts in our mouths. The medals would say one thing to the public. I would carry another story inside me, a story that started with a pile of jerry cans and ended in ways I would not then foresee, with a series of questions I could not unsee. After Hansfeld, the days folded into a kind of lesson I had not asked to learn. The scrap of paper in my pocket became a small private indictment. It was not that I suddenly understood all the mechanisms of war. It was that the world of numbers and factories began to press into the world of men and mud where I lived. Convoys, pipelines, nightly movements, these were not abstractions anymore. They were the things that decided whether a wound would be carried to a field hospital or left in the snow. We began to hear names in a new way. Pluto. The word sounded almost like a joke at first, a name you might give a secret operation the way children name forts. Then we learned it was a pipeline, a literal artery from the other side of the channel that could pump fuel where roads were clogged and bridges were down.
We heard about the Red Ball Express, and the picture that formed in my mind was no longer of men with rifles, but of lines of trucks running like veins through the night, drivers who slept in the cabs and kept moving no matter what. The sound of industry, the whir of engines in a factory, the creak of a ship's loading ramp became as decisive as a gunshot. The scale made decisions that had seemed tactical into something else entirely, strategic inevitabilities. I remember one report I read later in a paper, this is after the war, when such things came into public view, that described convoys moving day and night, unconcerned with the weather, unconcerned with the immediate danger. Those columns were fed by factories making fuel in quantities we could only imagine. The United States, by 1944, was producing on the order of 1.8 billion barrels of petroleum. Germany, by contrast, scraped together roughly 33 million barrels that same year from synthetic plants and limited natural sources. You can say it in numbers and it will sound like accounting. You can stand on a frozen field and smell petrol and it will feel like a moral argument. We also learned about the deliberate nature of supply denial. When the Allies pulled back or moved forward and captured depots, the aftermath was ugly in more than one way. Some depots were left to burn, whether by retreating forces who did not want the enemy to have them or by accidents during capture. Stavolo, a name that in the papers was attached to a picture of flame and night, became notorious because of what people saw there. A captured stock going up in an inferno that lit the plains for hours, a river of fire that seemed to eat everything. Stories described tanks parked like sentinels around a bonfire. Men said later that the sky was redder than battle. There were accounts of sections of countryside where the day after the blaze, it smelled like a city that had been on fire for a week. I do not tell you these things for drama. I tell you because they show the particular cruelty of logistics. The same thing that can save a man's life, a fuel convoy, a pipeline, can also be the source of terrible destruction when turned, mismanaged, or destroyed. The capture of 50,000 gallons in a single place like Hansfeld felt like a boon to our unit. But that number on a scrap of paper was small against the millions burned or the billions the enemy possessed. A captured depot could be both a lifeline and a tinderbox. There is another truth tied to these facts. Human psychology does strange things when it confronts abundance next to scarcity. I saw it in men who, the day before, could not find a cigarette, and the next found themselves hoarding jerry cans as if each could be a talisman. I saw it in officers who had ordered men forward and now cursed decisions made 1,000 miles away by people with access to machinery and maps.
The awareness that the enemy had more fuel, more trucks, more capacity, ate at morale. What had once felt like a test of will now felt like a comparison of factories. And when you begin to judge war by assembly lines and quotas, your understanding of heroism changes. I want to be careful here. None of this removes the immediacy of decisions on a field. A man who runs across open ground to pull a comrade from a burning vehicle acts in courage, regardless of the cost or the supply situation. Bravery is a real thing. But the context of bravery is not optional. When entire maneuvers hinge on whether a tank has fuel in its belly, bravery can become a perishable good. A well-timed charge can be rendered useless if the next day the unit cannot move because the nearest supply line has been cut. That moral tension haunted me in the weeks and years after Hansfeld. We also had to face acts that were ugly beyond mere logistics. The Malmedy massacre, the execution of prisoners, was not something that filtered through rumor for us. It arrived as a hard, bitter fact. When news reached our lines, men reacted with a mix of shame, anger, and fear. Some of us who had friends among those accused of participating in such actions wanted to deny it, to argue extenuating circumstances. Others, quieter, held the truth like a bruise. I make no attempt to soften this. The killing of prisoners of war is a crime, plain and simple. There is no tactical justification that erases the moral wrong. I condemn it without reservation. But acknowledging that condemnation does not end the moral conversation. It complicates it. At Hansfeld, we had men who did brave things, and at the same time, we were part of a military machine that, in pockets and moments of desperation, produced horror. The same conditions that produced the capacity for courage, the training, the orders, the bonds between men, also produced the means for wrongdoing. Scarcity twists judgment. When you are cold, hungry, and scared, decisions narrow. People act in ways they would not when they are well-fed and safe. Context does not excuse the act, but it does help explain how fragile the line between soldier and criminal can become. I have told this to myself in different ways over the years. Sometimes it has sounded like a defense, and I know how that can appear. Other times, it has sounded like an accusation. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. I was young. I followed orders.
I was tired. I knew that if a truck had gas, it could bring a wounded man to a surgeon who might save his life. These are small mercies and small tragedies tangled together. The battlefield consequences of logistics are easier to describe than they are to live with. You see them in the rows of intact vehicles, their engines silent, their paint still fresh where they had not been hit. You see them in half-tracks that sat with doors open and blankets still inside, waiting for a driver who would never return.
The image that burned into me was not a shattered tank with a gaping hole, but a modest column stuck in a lane because the lead vehicle had a dry tank. How many moments were lost to that simple, destructive fact? How many operations ground to a halt because wheels could not turn? I remember one afternoon after Hansfeld when we came upon a small clearing filled with machines that might as well have been toys without fuel. There were medium tanks, their crews having abandoned them because they could no longer move forward. A lieutenant I respected tried to start a pump and cursed because the fuel line was dry. Around us, men took stock, stretchers unfolded and then folded again because there was nowhere to carry the wounded. A driver who had been praised for his daring told me later in a voice low with shame about carrying a wounded comrade for miles because the ambulance company could not find diesel. You do not forget such images. They become proof that courage meets limits. When the Allied supply machine began to assert itself in a way that could not be matched by our production, it also began to affect the behavior of German troops. With more fuel, the Allies could probe, execute rapid flanking, and supply forward hospitals and repair units that kept machines running. With less, we were forced to concentrate what we had, to pick and choose where to spend a can of petrol. Those choices had human consequences. Men left behind, positions surrendered, days of marching that turned men into hollowed things. This disparity in industrial capacity was not a mystery. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, and others noted the strain. Speer wrote about the limits of production under constant attack and shifting strategy. I am not a historian who will assign blame beyond what the records show, but I will say this with the clarity of someone who lived under the strain. When your factories are bombed, when synthetic plants are destroyed or disrupted, your ability to fight becomes a matter of salvage and improvisation instead of design. The enemy that had continuous output did not merely have more material. He had the luxury of turning plans into movement over and over again. There is a bitter irony in a war so often told as the triumph of will, when in practice it was often the triumph of supply. The stories printed afterwards, the tales of heroism, the medals, the speeches, tend to focus on individual acts because they are simple to tell. They make good copy and they fit on a page. But the less tidy truth is that machines feed movement, and movement feeds opportunity. When the machines are on your side, you have the chance to do things that look heroic. When they are not, heroism becomes a last, lonely thing. My own medals came with that dissonance. At the town hall, in front of clapping strangers, the ribbon was a tidy story.
A few paragraphs in the local paper told of courage under fire. They printed my name. They used words like brave that sat uncomfortably in my mouth. In private, I could not quite reconcile what had been celebrated with what I had felt. There are nights I remember a man, not a general, not a famous figure, but a sergeant I admired, who later confessed he had slept with his boots on because he feared that a single night of rest might mean missing the chance to snag a can of fuel if the opportunity came. That kind of existence is hardly heroic in the way people like to imagine. In time, I tried to turn my discomfort into learning. I read accounts. I talked to men who had been on both sides of the experience. I listened to historians unpack systems I had barely noticed while living them. The Red Ball Express, for instance, became an object of grudging admiration, a logistical improvisation that kept forward units moving. Drivers, often African-American soldiers whose names were not always accorded the honor they deserved at the time, ran routes night after night hauling precious cargo. Piluto, the pipeline, was engineering bent to service, an underseating line that made a mockery of distance. These things were not glamorous, but they were decisive. You can throw troops into a gap and achieve a miracle in the moment, but without the means to keep them fed and moved, the miracle is fleeting. I want to pause here and bring this back to the human scale. Logistics may sound cold and mechanical, but the people behind them were flesh and bone. The men who drove in the Red Ball Express slept in their trucks, ate what they could, and did the monotonous work that battles possible. The women in workshops, the dock workers loading barrels, the engineers repairing pumps. Their labor kept life on the front. Honoring the dead means honoring not just the man who pulled a comrade from a burning vehicle, but the anonymous hand that turned a wrench at 2 in the morning so that a truck could roll. And yet there were moments when the work of supply created scenes of almost obscene abundance, juxtaposed with suffering. Photographs exist of piles of jerry cans untouched after a unit had moved on, of warehouses filled with crates, while men a few miles away starved for fuel and even basics. Those images seared into men's minds. The knowledge that somewhere a factory was humming, and that the sound of that hum could not be reached by your unit, was a kind of humiliation. It reshaped how men thought about the war and about themselves. There is also an ethical dimension that swallowed me whole. You can fight and take pride in saving lives and doing your duty, then later learn that the system you served justified or enabled acts you cannot condone. Reconciling those two things is the labor of a lifetime. I have never found a perfect reconciliation.
Sometimes I would tell myself that I acted as any man would under given circumstances. Other times I would stare at my ribbon and feel it weigh like an accusation. It is not self-pity, it is accounting. We must reckon with what has been done in our name and by our hands, even if our hands were small parts of a huge machine. As the war ended and the years advanced, I visited battlefields less and libraries and archives more. Curiosity can be a way of making sense, and perhaps that was my motive, to put the scrap of paper alongside a ledger and see where the two met. I learned that the capture of a single depot, even one with 50,000 gallons, was rarely decisive in itself. Instead, it was emblematic, a clear, visible sign of a mismatch in capacity. Millions of gallons could be destroyed in a single action, billions could be produced in a year. Those scales determine options. They decide who moves and who waits. They decide which towns are relieved and which are left to freeze. There were moments of cruelty that left no room for abstraction. The Stabalo fire, the ruined depots, the sight of wounded men waiting because ambulances lacked fuel, the execution of prisoners. These are not things you argue about. They are things you name and condemn. I have tried to do both, to name and to understand. To name is moral. To understand is practical. One without the other leaves you with either hollow indignation or cold detachment. I have aimed for neither extreme. When I go to museums now, and I go sometimes because memory is a thing that wants company, I am struck by what is absent from the plaques. The public story is compressed into heroism, the charge, the defensive stand, the face in a sepia photograph. Rarely do those displays expand to show the chain of supply that made the event possible or impossible. Rarely do they tell of the men who drove at night in endless lines, or the women who kept factories running. There is a place for individual remembrance, but there is also a moral duty to tell the fuller story. Once, years after the war, I took my grandson to a museum. He was 10 and impatient and loved the idea of tanks and shiny things. He climbed up into the turret with the reckless joy of children and asked plainly, as children do, why didn't they just move? He pointed at a tank with an open hatch and a gauge frozen at empty. That question, simple, direct, is the clearest moral test I know. How do you answer a child who asks why a powerful machine sat mute while men suffered? I told him the awkward truth. Sometimes the machine needed something it did not have. Sometimes the people who could have given it that thing were far away or unable to reach it. He looked at me, then at the tank, and then shrugged. Later he asked me if I had been brave. I told him what I have told you. Bravery happened, but so did limits. If I have one lesson from decades of thinking, it is this: honor courage without hiding the facts that frame it. When we flatten stories into tidy narratives of hero and villain, we lose the harder work of understanding causation and responsibility. We risk making monuments out of men while ignoring the system that both cursed and enabled them. Holding the two ideas together, the bravery of individuals and the centrality of logistics, is uncomfortable. It is also necessary. At 91, the feeling of fraudulence is real because the public story never touched the private ache. The world applauded a face and a ribbon. Inside, I kept a folded scrap of paper and the smell of petrol on my gloves. I carry both. The fraud I speak of is not an indictment of the men who cheered. It is an admission that a single emblem cannot capture the tangled moral geometry of what we lived through. Being called a hero felt at times like a polite error, an attempt by a society to grasp something it could not fully see. I do not expect absolution, nor do I seek it. What I seek, quietly, is an honest remembering. Remember the men who did brave things, remember the suffering they endured, but also remember the factories, the convoys, the pipelines that made movement possible. Remember the ways scarcity can deform judgment, and the ways abundance can be turned into a weapon. Remember the crimes, plainly and without softening. If honoring the fallen means anything, it means telling the whole story. So what do we do with this? How do we carry it forward in a way that honors both truth and sacrifice? I will offer one modest suggestion. Teach complexity. When we tell young people about wars, teach them the interplay of courage and capacity. Show them the diagrams of supply and the faces of drivers. Tell them that metals mean something, but so do ledgers and factories. Encourage them to ask the uncomfortable questions. Who fed the armies? Who paid in labor and life to supply the front? How did decisions far from the line shape what happened at the front? If you walk through a museum and you see a ribbon or a photograph, ask about the other things not written on the plaque. Ask whether the soldier's action was enabled by a supply line or constrained by its absence. Ask also what the soldier himself thought afterwards. You might be surprised how often the answer is complicated and how often that complication is precisely the point. I do not close this with a tidy moral. Life rarely offers them. But if you take anything from what I have shared, let it be this. Bravery is real, but it can be hollowed by the realities of production and supply. Scars remain even after medals are hung, and our duty to remember is more demanding than placing a ribbon on a chest. I have been called a hero, and I have felt like a fraud. Both are true. Neither negates the other. If this moved you, share it with someone who values history and complexity. If you want to go deeper, check the description for sources and a documentary link that looks at the logistics behind the front lines. The story of one morning in December is one hinge among many in a larger tale, and the more we learn, the better we can honor what was sacrificed without erasing what was done.